Hello everyone, this is part 26 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist. To see more, comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Azuki Yugao stood atop the hotel looking down into the street below, seeking her impulsive, temperamental subordinate with the setting sun on her back. She knew Naruto had stormed out through the main entrance, and would have emerged here, but she still hadn't seen him. She didn't blame the blonde, to be sure, not this time. Yugao shook her plum-haired head and used Shunshin to move to the ground, where her new vantage point allowed her to glimpse a shivering and pale Inuzuka Kiba pressed against the wall near the hotel's door. The Anbu Kunoichi managed to notice the wet spot on his trousers at once. She couldn't blame him either. Her own previous exposure to Naruto in his less restrained state, during the Chunin exams, had been enough to convince her that this power inside him was something monstrous. And her captain wasn't around to stop the blonde this time. The canine genin noticed her, and pointed down the street with a shaking hand. Hang on a second, Anbu-san. Let me go along too. Yugao pressed down the urge to cut the stupid prick open where he stood, blurting out her covet rank like that in public. To his immense luck and hers, Naruto's earlier rampage had sent the locals scattering in terror, and there was no one else within hearing range. Negative, genin. You haven't got either the skills or the gonads to handle Naruto right now. Leave him to me. Kiba regained a little color and opened his maw, but Yugao outright ignored him and moved down the road, and as she did so, Naruto's continued direction became more and more apparent with each step. Tanzaku Gai's revelers were clustered along the roadsides, leaving a wide swath in the center. The ANBU's trained senses could almost taste the lingering malice and rage in the air, and she shook her head in mild disapproval. His being pissed was one matter, but as a shinobi, he should have been able to keep a tighter hold on his emotions. But then, if I had learned that my father had done such a thing to me. Azuki Yugao hadn't been born in Konoha, and as a result, she hadn't experienced the Nine Tails' genocidal attack on the village. Rather, the Kunoichi had been born into a prominent samurai clan and had taken to the soldiers' arts like a minnow to the water, swordsmanship in particular. However, women were not allowed to serve within the Fire Lord's armies, an old and revolting tradition that still somehow managed to live on. Rather than allowing her talents to go to waste, her clan had chosen to send her to Konoha, with the Fire Lord's approval, in an attempt to strengthen ties between the daimyo and the nation's prosperous shinobi village. That seemed like so long ago now. Yugao had been 11 at the time, and Konoha had still been in serious disrepair in the monster's wake. She'd learned to manipulate chakra while learning to use the sword, and had been able to adapt to shinobi training with ease, passing the genin exam within 6 months and making Chunin in an additional 12, and had been scouted into Anbu at age 16. It's been over 6 years now, it really does feel like a long time. The woman accepted her commission into the Corps without a moment's thought, as the Hokage's personal guard espoused ideals much more in line with the samurai code she had been raised to respect. Absolute devotion to one's village was a concept Yugao had never quite been able to come to proper terms with, though she had tried, and swearing her skills and service to one master, the Hokage, was something that seemed much more natural and right to her. She and Naruto were too much alike in that regard, though in his case, he hated the village but loved the Hokage, and his personal ethics never entered into the equation. Yugao thought that she understood her subordinate better than his peers due to this like ideal, and was better able to empathize with his struggles. And that's why she didn't quite view the fourth Hokage through the same rose-tinted lenses as others in Konoha might have. The Yondaime was a great shinobi and a true hero whose actions had saved Konoha to be sure, but he was also a man who had, no matter how admirable his reasons, committed a reprehensible crime against an innocent child. That child was his own son, no less. Yugao didn't hate Namikaze Minato, or even resent him, but she hadn't known him either, unlike her colleagues in the Corps, and wasn't as inclined to revere the fourth as a natural consequence. The Yondaime hadn't saved and protected her as he had them. Yugao did, however, believe that the man had loved his son, and had not sealed the demon into him in order to hurt him. Those intentions didn't lessen or make right what Naruto had struggled through as a result. For all he'd been through, no matter how hard she'd railed against his inclusion into Anbu at the start, Naruto now had her complete respect, and even admiration. I must be getting closer now. Yugao noted that a light mist was rolling in, as the sun completed its descent. However, a sparse evening mist wasn't at all an uncommon sight during the winter months, and the kunoichi continued on with no particular concern, rounding a corner that led towards the Pleasure Town's restaurant district, where she would no doubt locate Naruto gorging ramen at some cheap dive, or something similar. However, the subtle haze began to coalesce and thicken at a most unnatural rate, and within mere moments, Yugao had a much tougher time seeing even the near buildings. The swordswoman's honed senses went into high alert. She'd encountered enough kirinin during her time in Anbu to recognize this odorless, chakra-tinged vapor. Kirigakure no jutsu. The mist thickened even more, to the point where even breathing became a somewhat more laborious task. The electric street lights did more harm than good, illuminating nothing within the mist, while serving as a distraction. Her trained instincts marked the hostile presence within the mist at once, approaching at a high speed. She tried her best to ignore and tune out the scared voices around her, as the remaining civilians in the street panicked with the sudden blinding haze and rushed indoors. Yugao shouted out into the mist, as she wasn't concerned with revealing her current position, knowing too well that her opponent knew her exact location. Hoshigaki Kisame. Yugao's senses sparked, and she hopped into the air and somersaulted. A large weapon covered in cloth wrappings rushed beneath where she had been standing, at the right height and position to sever her legs at the kneecaps. The attack's speed was such that she glimpsed Samehada's long silhouette but a split second, and then the shaver was gone, retreating as its criminal master continued onwards in the other direction. Yugao hadn't heard the shark man either coming or going, and she would have been a cripple had she not been such a seasoned adept in kenjutsu, with the resulting sixth sense. Hoshigaki Kisame's barbaric chuckle LD through the mist, seeming to originate in all directions. He, oh, it's so nice to be remembered. You're a sharp one indeed, sweetheart. As soon as Yugao touched down against the concrete, she concentrated chakra into her legs and recoiled as high into the air as possible in an attempt to escape the mist. She managed to soar over the thick veil, but a slight aquamarine glow beneath was all the notice she got, as a water shark missile burst emerged the mist behind her. She pulled out her katana in midair, and turned and SD the jutsu into halves, causing the water to plummet back into the mist in twin streams. A second mist emerged behind her, arcing in midair to streak towards her back. Yugao grimaced and kicked against the liquid construct, using chakra to stick to the moving water mass, in essence, riding Kisame's jutsu over and across the mist. The shark twisted again in midair and began to dive down into the haze again, however, and Yugao had to abandon her perch, leaping towards a near building. Two more water sharks streaked out. One began a direct pursuit while the last climbed higher into the air and then turned around to pincer her. Damn! The plum-haired Anbu twisted to the side in midair, allowing the pursuing shark to rush past her and slam into its incoming cohort. However, rather than both missiles being apart with the collision, the two Suten constructs instead merged into a single larger shark. The combined enormous missile turned about to chase the descending kunoichi and slammed into Yugao at a high speed, driving her down into the street below. The woman grunted as she slammed down hard into the concrete, taking the hit on her back. The large shark exploded into upon making contact with the ground, drenching Yugao's kimono and soaking her skin beneath. She rolled aside at once, movement impeded a little due to the waterlogged robe she wore, to avoid Samehada as Kisame moved in close and attempted to crunch her arm with a downward heave. The scaled Zanbatsu made a shallow crater in the concrete, and several cement shards bit into Yugao's covered leg. Tell me where Naruto is, criminal. Yugao let loose her kimono, leaving her clad in a white, sleeveless undergarment robe that reached down to cover her thighs and little else. She might as well have been in the cold December night, and being soaking wet made matters worse. The Akatsuki member's cruel chuckle penetrated the air again, this time close behind her. Ah, such tender devotion, makes me all warm and cuddlesome inside. She saw a tall shadow raising Samehada in her peripheral vision, and executed a quick reverse S with her katana, driving her beloved's blade parallel to her wrist into the monstrous swordsman. Kisame dropped Samehada and gurgled to her side, and Yugao let out a relieved sigh, but the Akatsuki warrior then exploded into water, as did his sword. The water began to swirl around her, and the Anbu hissed and leapt to the side, slicing through a second water clone's hand as it reached out to execute Suiru no Jutsu in a simultaneous motion. The same trick wouldn't catch her more than once. Answer the question. Her answer came in another incoming attack, which she rolled to the side to avoid. A harsh tremor shook the ground, and large cracks appeared spanning the pavement beneath her. The resulting shockwave cleared the mist in Yugao's immediate area a little, and she was able to glimpse Samehada, the real one this time, speared deep into the earth next to where the kunoichi had been standing a moment prior, buried almost a meter into the ground. The shaver's master was nowhere to be seen, indicating that the towering shark man had thrown the sword. The attack would have missed the Anbu had she not even moved, and she realized that Kisum wasn't aiming to K her. This bastard's just toying with me. The vile mist thickened once again within seconds, blanketing the street as though it had never been dispersed and reducing Samehada to a mere shadow in the haze. The kunoichi let out a slow breath and concentrated, attempting to see what couldn't be seen, and to hear what couldn't be heard. Yugao's senses alerted her to a presence close behind her position that was approaching at a deliberate, almost stalking pace. The purple-haired Anbu whirled around and SD at what she presumed was Kisum, but hit nothing but missed, as he avoided the stroke and appeared to her side. Yugao tried to correct her motion, but Kisum sidestepped the blow again, and then snatched her wrist using his monstrous, superhuman strength. This time, it was no water clone. She remembered his power quite well, and this Kisum was the genuine article. She gritted her teeth as the rogue Kirinin squeezed down on her slender wrist almost hard enough to snap the bone into pieces. Ugh, beast. Kisum chuckled and twisted her arm behind her back into a hammerlock, causing the plum-haired kunoichi to drop her katana, which clattered against the cracked and busted pavement. Yugao stood no chance against the Akatsuki swordsman's brute strength. His hot, rotting breath invaded her nostrils as he leaned over to croon into her ear, trailing a rough hand against her cheek, and the kunoichi had to struggle to repress a shudder. You'll be seeing the Jinchuriki soon enough. Till then, have a nice nap, princess. The vice-captain tried to resist, but she was powerless in her current position, as Kisum had her twisted in such a manner that escape was impossible. She sucked in a breath as his massive thumb pressed into a pressure point on her N, but to no avail. The shark man's chakra spiked into her, and she collapsed unconscious in his grip. XXXXXXXXXX. Naruto continued to gawk, not quite believing his situation. Uchiha Itachi stared down at him beneath a bamboo casa ringed with paper strips, wearing his cloud-patterned cloak. The older teenager spoke, and the Itachi said something so strange given the situation in his quiet, emotionless voice that the Jinchuriki almost laughed despite his perilous predicament. Good evening, Naruto-kun. The blonde tried to act calmer than he was inside at the moment, and reached back to palm his sake bottle. He knew he'd screwed the pooch and big this time. Here he was, isolated in some strange town, and now Akatsuki had come calling. Again. The truth was that his heart was pounding in his chest. Despite battles with more monstrous shinobi, like Hoshigaki Kisum, Momoki Zabuza and Orochimaru, and a genuine monster in Kimimaro at the end, none were quite as intimidating as the placid teenager who was now hovering over him, staring straight through him with his swirling crimson dujutsu. Naruto checked his hand to make certain it wasn't shaking and then took a long, slow pull on the bottle to steel his courage. You know, this surprise visit is getting old real quick. I do take appointments. His sleeve dropped a little as he sipped, exposing the Kusanagi's handle at his wrist. The Uchiha noticed this at once. Naruto knew somehow, though the older teenager didn't move his penetrating stare in the least. The Jinchuriki was stalling, attempting to scan his surroundings to decide on an escape route, but Itachi seemed not to care too much. A good shinobi wastes no opportunities. You will please come with me, now. Naruto rose and put his bottle down again, and then grabbed the fourth scroll and replaced it in his robes. The demon vessel hesitated a moment, and then his hand moved in a motion almost too quick to be seen and drew the Kusanagi, plunging the short sword into Itachi's stomach. The Jinchuriki used chakra to extend the blade to several times its normal length, and slammed the Akatsuki member into a building across the street. Naruto pulled the Kusanagi back, and Itachi's corpse slid to the ground, the gaping hole in the Uchiha's stomach gushing blood onto the pavement. Naruto stalked across the road to where the S-man collapsed on the ground, and knelt over his bleeding husk. Hey, I don't think so. Without making a sound, Itachi's head craned upwards to look at the blonde, still with its slack expression. Naruto grimaced and leapt back, as something stirred within the still leaking hole in the older teen's gut. A single black bird burst out, down matted with gore. The blood-stained raven circled over Itachi's corpse, and several more emerged as well, making a literal M. The birds all rushed at Naruto and pecked at the Jinchuriki, who scowled and swung his sword at the converging mob to scatter the lot. The ravens cawed in unison and converged back into a black mass, which took shape as Itachi once again, looking at Naruto with his emotionless stare. The blonde took another hesitant step back and glanced between the Itachi standing to his side, who made no move to attack, and the Itachi bleeding and broken on the ground, and then around the bustling street. Naruto noted that at some point or another, the townspeople had all vanished into thin air. At that point, realization clicked into his mind. TCH, just an illusion, so obvious. Naruto concentrated chakra into his neural network and blinked as he released it in a pulse to disrupt the Uchiha's illusion. The two Itachi images dissipated, as did the blood pooled on the ground. Nervous chatter trickled into the blonde's ear, as he stood in the road holding his sword and swinging like a madman at nothing, at least in the spectator's perspective. He sheathed the blade, shaking his head. He also noted that the real Uchiha Itachi was no longer in sight. The term, real, assuming that the Akatsuki who had accosted him at the ramen place, which was now across the street, had been the genuine article to begin with. He had to have been real, as someone needed to have applied the genjutsu at the start. A thin mist began to roll down the cobbled street, originating in the same direction the blonde had entered the area through. As Naruto pondered that, he heard Itachi's voice address him again, echoing in the air, though the Uchiha was still nowhere to be seen. That was quite impressive, Naruto-kun. You managed to see through the genjutsu with little trouble. However, the mist started to thicken, and Naruto's better-than-average vision availed him not too much in the dense haze. He recognized the strange vapor at once as chakra mist, as Momoki Zabuza had used the same technique against him back at that time. The same men who had saved the blonde's ass then were now the ones attacking him, as he was most certain that Itachi's absent to this point partner Hoshigaki Kisame had created the mist. Naruto didn't know whether or not the tall Kirinukanen was as adept in Silent King as his old, now S7 swordsman comrade Zabuza, and he sure wasn't planning on loitering around in the blinding vapor to learn. The blonde Jinchuriki used his Akuma Shunshin to escape the street, and materialize atop the nearest wooden building. Kisame's mist still swirled around his ankles, but he could at least see. Though perhaps he might have been better served to remain blinded in the road, as when he turned to gauge his surroundings, Naruto saw Itachi standing on the building's small penthouse, again peering down at him as though he'd been waiting in that spot the entire time, and had planned on his targets leaping onto that particular building. So, right into the house. But, I'm not like some dumb animal. Naruto reached towards his blade again, but almost as soon as his hand started to move, a tanto pressed against his wrist, though not hard enough to draw blood. Itachi managed to shunshin in next to the Jinchuriki with such speed that the blonde couldn't trail the movement. The Akatsuki illusionist removed his short blade a second later, but kept it at his side as a clear warning not to attempt the move again. Don't misunderstand me. I have come here because I would like us to talk. There need not be bloodshed. The demon vessel let out a cold, bitter chuckle and parroted the other teenager's words. You want to talk? That's ridiculous. You won't trick me like that. Itachi didn't bother to respond in words, as though Naruto's reaction was something that he expected. Rather, the Akatsuki member showed a thin, veiled smile that seemed to indicate approval, though one could never tell with someone like him. The Uchiha turned his attention towards a remote spot on the building. You're late, Kisame. The shark man appeared in swirling vapor a split second later, hoisting an unconscious Izuki Yugao in his massive arms. Kisame paid no heed whatsoever to Naruto's poisonous glare and deposited his motionless captive on the ground in a less than gentle manner. This one put up a little struggle. The swordsman nudged Yugao in the ribs with his sandal as he spoke. The Jinchuriki noticed her near undressed state, and that her hair was sopping wet. She also didn't have her katana, which must have been lost during her short battle with Kisame. Naruto wasn't ignorant as to the sentimental value that Gekko Hei's blade had to the woman, and hoped that some low person wouldn't come across and decide to steal it. Itachi took a moment to measure the situation, looking down at Yugao and the back to Naruto. I see. Now then, Naruto-kun. Cooperate with us and I will return her unharmed. Naruto cursed the unconscious Kunoichi in his mind. He could have escaped using his Juin evolution, as neither Akatsuki Shinobi had means to pursue him through the skies, at least to his knowledge. Now, however, getting out was impossible. The blonde could do nothing except go along with whatever Itachi wanted, and he was quite certain that it was more than a simple chat, or else Yugao would be ked. Naruto crossed his arms and hissed out a breath into the cold night. Damn. Fine. Suppose I've got no other choice. You wanted to talk, so, start talking. Itachi removed his kasa and tossed it onto the ground, motioning back towards the penthouse apartment he'd been standing atop earlier. This location isn't suitable. You and I will go inside there. The Jinchuriki watched Itachi through narrowed SS. He wasn't on board with breaking into someone's home like that. Naruto could K people, or mug them, but this bothered him somehow. He also wondered what the reason was, whether the other man was taking precautions against potential eavesdroppers, or didn't want Kisum to hear whatever he planned on discussing with the blonde. The shark man seemed to presume the latter, as he regarded the two teenagers with a suspicious expression, Itachi in particular. Then, she comes in with us. I'm not leaving her out in this weather dressed like that, or alone with him. The shark grinned through his teeth in response to the blonde's implied accusation, though he did nothing to validate it. Itachi looked into the overcast night, silent as he considered Naruto's demand, and at last nodded his agreement. That will be acceptable. Kisum, keep watch out here until I return. Hoshigaki Kisum didn't seem pleased with being given orders, and more so at being posted as a mere lookout. However, the Mist Nukanen grunted his acknowledgement as Naruto retrieved Yugao and scooped the slender Kunoichi into his arms. Her skin was ice cold, and he thought that she might need medical attention later. The blonde considered making his escape now that he'd retrieved her, but didn't do so and instead made to move into the apartment, outside which Itachi was still waiting. The Uchiha had chosen a position that would have allowed Naruto to make a clean break, like he was tempting the Jinchuriki on purpose, knowing that the latter wouldn't leave and renege on the agreement. The missing nin's cold, logical poise irritated Naruto not a little, as he had never liked being manipulated, but still he entered the strange apartment with Yugao in his arms. This is just too surreal. The reason Naruto remained had little to do with honor or ethics. No, Itachi's actions puzzled and intrigued him. There was no reason to have maintained a lie about his motivations in approaching the blonde when Kisum had a prisoner to use against Naruto. Perhaps the Uchiha was showing an illusion within an illusion, but the Jinchuriki was more inclined to think that he was being honest, that he somehow did want to have a talk. Naruto looked around the nice apartment and placed the cold, shivering Yugao onto a plush-looking couch, draping a blanket over her as he entered into the small dining area. Itachi was now sitting in a high-backed chair at an ornate wooden dinner table, and an old man and woman were sprawled out on the carpet near the entrance to the kitchen. The Akatsuki member noticed Naruto's attention on the elder couple, and explained in his monotone voice. Those two are under a genjutsu-induced sleep, not S. I will release them when we leave this place. Naruto seed his head and pondered the strange enigma that was Uchiha Itachi, who could M his own mother and T his little brother into near madness, but chose to spare two complete strangers here. He didn't care, to be sure, but it was something that piqued his interest. At last he shrugged and leaned against the dining room wall. I would have cared them both instead. No use in leaving loose ends. Itachi shot him a look that could have been laced with irritation, but he couldn't tell. I do not care to indulge in senseless Naruto-kun. Please take a seat here. The demon container quirked a brow at that statement, as in his estimation, the Uchiha M could be called little else than such. No matter what, Naruto still didn't trust him. The blonde held his ground, and crossed his arms again with a mulish expression. No, I think I'll keep standing. Itachi's slate-covered head swiveled over to regard Naruto, who once again stared into his swirling Sharingan. The criminal Uchiha ghosted a small, cold smile, and then screwed his crimson orbs tight. He opened them again a second later, and the spinning increased in speed, and at last his Sharingan went wide and bloodshot, Tomo extending into his pupils. Naruto gasped and staggered towards Itachi while reaching towards the Kusanagi, as he began being sucked into something. This, what in the mother-thing hell? The Jinchuriki collapsed to his knees as his vision went pitch black and the earth seemed to disappear into nothingness. At once he attempted a genjutsu cancel, but to no avail. Naruto bit his cheek hard enough to draw blood, but that didn't work either as he plummeted into an endless chasm, or perhaps a void would be more accurate. Back in the real world, he was unconscious and twitching on the ground, with Itachi staring down at him with a dark, almost sinister smile through the Mangekyo Sharingan, until he too leaned hard against his seat. XXXXXXXXXX. At around the same time in Konoha, Yuhi Kurenai sat in a restaurant booth opposite Sarutobi Asuma sipping at her shochu. She spent the past week recuperating in the hospital due to the wound she'd incurred in the Akatsuki's attack on Konoha, shielding Ino against the explosion at the hot springs. Her wrist was still immobilized in a splint underneath her single red sleeve, where it had been crushed beneath a large boulder, and her back was now covered with small white scars due to sharp airborne debris cutting into her nude skin. The healed wounds were still a little bit tender, and Kurenai leaned over her table so as not to press her back against her seat. Asuma reached down into the pocket on his shinobi vest and grumbled as he swallowed a bite. Damn, I could use a smoke. The illusionist snickered at the bearded shinobi's ceaseless griping about the restaurant's no-smoking rule. She reached over her plate with her chopsticks and grabbed a bite, and placed it down onto Asuma's. Here, have some octopus instead. The man's cheeks seemed to take on a green tinge as he stared down at the salted octopus. Asuma shook his head and shoved the plate to the table's center, taking a draught on his imported beer. I'll pass on that, thanks. The kunoiki smiled and reclaimed the morsel, chewing and swallowing her bite while her dinner date tried to repress a shudder. You're worried about something, Kurenai. That kid, again. There was no real irritation in the man's voice, where there would have been a couple months earlier. Asuma's attitude towards her old student had done a turnaround since the Oto and Suna invasion, and with good reason. And he was right, she was concerned about Naruto quite a bit, given the various stories she'd heard over the past week concerning the Akatsuki attack, and the reasons behind their coming. A power as radical as what her old student, assuming he could even be called such, possessed would bring about those who would seize upon it. Kurenai emptied her cup with a sigh and placed it on the table. You're right. Sending him out on a mission now is insane. Those missing nin might still be lurking somewhere close to here. More than Naruto, however, Kurenai worried about her other ex-student, who had been picked to go on the same mission. Kiba lacked the blonde's power and SK, and was even more at risk in a battle against high-level opponents like the Akatsuki. Naruto could at least hold his own, and wouldn't be killed barring an accident, as the Nukenin were interested in taking him alive. Asuma scratched his beard in thought, and tried to reassure her. The old man's out with him, though, so I wouldn't be concerned about that so much. Kurenai pushed down a schoolmarmish urge to lecture Asuma on showing proper respect towards the Sandaime. She tried to agree, to believe that the Akatsuki wouldn't risk approaching the third, but that wasn't certain. For his sake, the woman didn't voice her doubts. Strained though their relationship was even now, the bearded man still loved his dad, and would be crushed to see something tragic happen to him. Naruto's closeness to the Sandaime, and not Kurenai, was the real reason that Asuma seemed to resent the Jinchuriki so much in the past. Asuma had never had such a bond with the man, and had seemed to believe that Naruto had thus stolen his sire's devotion, becoming the old man's son, and somehow replacing his actual one, though he had never mentioned as much. Not wanting to tread those waters with her date, Kurenai latched onto the emphasis in what Asuma had said a moment earlier. You would be concerned about something. Asuma shrugged and emptied his remaining beer with one long swallow, and then motioned the waiter to bring him another. Kurenai glanced at her emptied wine bottle and considered doing the same, but decided against it. She liked her alcohol as much as the next person and a good bit more than some, but also unlike some, she knew her limits and never drank to excess. Her companion remained silent a moment, and measured his response. Put me in his shoes and I'd be thinking about going AWOL right about now, that's all. Kurenai shot her bearded companion a venomous look across the table and gritted out a harsh denial. That's ridiculous. Naruto would never abandon Konoha like that. The woman propped her good elbow against the wooden tabletop and rested her chin on her hand with a sigh. She couldn't know what Naruto would do. His situation was precarious at best. The villagers were acting worse than ever towards him, due in some part to his not being present to intimidate them into silence. Kurenai supposed that she might be able to comprehend, though not empathize with, their anger, having seen the regrettable devastation that the Akatsuki attack had caused. She too had almost been killed in the bombing and would bear the scars on her back, but she couldn't blame Naruto, who couldn't control what he was. The illusionist didn't want to see her student, friend, little brother, whatever he is. Certainly not son, I'm not that old. Her, Naruto, lacking a more appropriate term, be coerced into leaving to appease some missing nin organization, no matter how dangerous the group. Rather than using her chopsticks in the normal manner, she speared her last bite on one, driving the blunt end into and through the octopus with a violent thrust. Asuma had opened his mouth to respond, but winced at her action and instead raised his hands in a surrender pose. I guess it's not a big deal, since he's not here no matter what. There's no need to get all worked up. Kurenai raised her head and massaged her brow with her usable hand. That was vintage Asuma, avoiding an argument at all costs. She ate the octopus, savoring its taste as he motioned the waiter and requested the bill. As the bearded man paid, she rose and crossed her arms, holding her immobilized wrist in place with the other. The genjutsu mistress made towards the entrance, and waited outside the restaurant, considering what Asuma had said a moment earlier. Perhaps she was getting too worked up about something she had no control over. All right, you've got a point, I suppose. A low M was the response Kurenai received, and the kunoichi turned around in time to almost get blasted with exhaled cigarette smoke. The moment Asuma stepped outside, he had a cancer stick in one hand and his lighter in the other, and he wasted no time in lighting up. The woman stared up into the overcast skies, turning her head so as not to inhale Asuma's second hand. I hope nothing bad is going to happen. The moon then poked through the clouds, shining bright as though in response. XXXXXXXXXX. For what seemed like hours, Naruto plummeted downward within an endless void, until he at last slammed into something solid, and blacked out. The Jinchuriki awoke in an instant, and realized at once that he was no longer in that strange place, but instead in a new, even stranger one. Naruto was standing, though he knew that he hadn't stood under his own power, in what seemed to be a street, with a radiant sunset and a crimson moon illuminating the skies overhead. However, the street, the buildings surrounding, and the people milling about without a sound were all colored in black and white. The demon container let out a slow breath and looked down at his hands. He, too, was colored in black and white. The place was as silent as the grave, and the people strolled past him like he wasn't even there. Naruto likened the experience to being stuck inside an old silent movie. I must be dreaming. He'd thought that Itachi had placed him in another genjutsu and had tried all the counter methods he knew, but nothing had worked. And this weird construct, whatever the hell it might be, was much too obvious to be some mere illusion. A genjutsu was rendered next to useless when its target was able to recognize it as such, and Naruto knew that Itachi had more skill than to be this blatant. His tongue darted out and licked his lip where he'd nipped on it earlier in an attempt to break whatever technique he was trapped inside. The Jinchuriki at last acknowledged that he had no clue how to escape this strange place, and he took a closer look at his surroundings. He recognized the insignia that appeared on the locals' clothing in several places, and that also appeared on various signs and banners placed outside the buildings. This place is. A quiet voice completed his sentence, breaking through the oppressive silence. The Uchiha district in Konoha, as it appeared the night the clan was MD. Naruto craned his head to the source. Itachi was walking towards him, dressed in his Akatsuki robes. The blonde shinobi hadn't seen or heard the renegade Uchiha coming, but he supposed that was no real surprise. This place was the other teenagers' making, that much was obvious. The Uchiha district, as Naruto knew it, was a rotting ghost town. He'd looked through the place once or twice in the past, though its one current resident had never noticed his presence. At that moment, the people in the image began to drop impaled with kunai and shuriken in some cases, and cut down with what seemed to be an invisible sword in others. Ink black blood spilled onto the cobbled street and elsewhere. Naruto snorted at Itachi, who stood silent in place, observing the Jinchuriki with no noticeable emotion, as though he didn't care about the carnage around him in the least. You meant, the night you MD the clan. An Uchiha woman nearest the two spectators seemed to scream in terror as her kin were made around her. She didn't appear to be a kunoichi, though her station wouldn't have mattered a bit against what was coming to kill her. Naruto saw a blur, and then her severed head spun through the air towards him. Itachi, however, seemed to have no problem trailing the entire thing. The Jinchuriki winced as the gruesome thing impacted his chest, but the blood-stained head passed right through him to bounce against the pavement behind him, as though he were an incorporeal specter, rolling to a stop several meters down the road and leaving a blackened trail in its wake. Itachi strolled to stand next to the woman's headless corpse as it spilled blood all over the road. Meanwhile, a person in Anbu combat gear, though without the mask, materialized in a low crouch a little down the road, sword drawn and held behind him. Naruto knew who it was at once. The Uchiha clan was a disease, Naruto-kun, a rotting cancer that needed to be excised. I spare them little remorse. He listened to the Akatsuki members' murmured words, likewise not caring in the least about the gruesome scene. Meanwhile the Anbu Itachi rose and looked around the street, keeping his blade steadied at his side. The previous K had been so quick that there was no blood on the ninjakin he held, and his armor was likewise immaculate. 6 more Uchiha Shinobi, men that Naruto recognized as Konoha MPs, then materialized in the road. Naruto was able to read their lip movements enough to make out the enraged curses and accusations that the Shinobi hurled at their clan's genius in vain. The MPs rushed Itachi in unison, and the Anbu dispatched them all with ease, never needing so much as a second strike. The blonde stood within the melee, looking around as the corpses hit the ground all around him. The past. Itachi glanced down at the kinsman with what looked like utter contempt and then turned and started towards one residence in particular. The perfect shinobi, I can't even begin to compare with him, not then, and sure as hell not now. Itachi glanced back at Naruto while arching an aristocratic brow ever so little, as though he had somehow heard the container's thoughts. The Akatsuki member gave no indication that he appreciated the grudging compliment, however. Naruto was glad to note that the S seemed to have ended, and realized that Itachi must have decided to show him the M's end, rather than the entire Holocaust. Not because Naruto pitied the Uchiha clan or regretted their passing, but rather because his ego didn't like having to see and experience how meager his talents as a shinobi were in comparison to his companion, even when the genius was still the same age as Naruto was now. The Jinchuriki crossed his arms, meeting Itachi's calm stare in equal measure. There's no real reason to show me this. I didn't give a damn about this incident when it happened, and I don't care now either. Itachi didn't respond, but instead started walking down the street towards the large house his past counterpart had entered into. Naruto gritted his teeth in irritation but still heeded the obvious command to go with the Akatsuki member, not at all wanting to be isolated within this strange illusion realm, or whatever the hell it was. The renegade Uchiha came to a stop outside the house, and waited until the blonde arrived next to him. Naruto peered into the building through the nearest window, but he could glimpse nothing except the earlier black void within. Itachi's quiet voice drew his attention once more. I will reveal the purpose soon enough, so please be patient until then. Time has no meaning within Tsukuyomi, unless I will it so. The power to control even time, Naruto thought the statement ludicrous. However, he had to act as though it were true, and dared not risk calling Itachi on it while he remained imprisoned inside this nightmarish place. The Sharingan master crossed right through the open threshold without another word, and then seemed to vanish into the black nothingness within. Naruto steeled his nerve and moved along behind, casting a last lingering glance over the reenacted S in his wake. Might as well. He expected to emerge within the house, but instead he stepped into a shallow stream, recognizing the trees that were now all around as those that grew in the woods outside Konoha. The door he had come through was gone. The Jinchuriki blinked and looked around the wooded area in a bid to discern his exact location, but that ominous black void lingered past the trees. Meanwhile, while Naruto realized that he was standing ankle-deep in moving water, the sensations that he might associate with it weren't there. There was no coldness, or wetness, again as though he were inside this place, but also wasn't at the same time. Naruto whirled about in response to a light tapping on his shoulder, and hissed a breath upon seeing Itachi again. The Uchiha pointed towards a place in the horizon. Look over there. The blonde glared, but did as instructed. Downstream a distance, he could see the earlier, past, Itachi kneeling in the manner that Naruto did when giving a mission report to the Hokage, still in his Anbu gear. However, the man he was reporting to was no Sarutobi. The person had an ominous look about him, dressed in dark clothing with spiked black hair, and he was hunched over as he peered down at the Anbu Itachi. The man's head looked as though it had been torn apart and slapped back together on one side, and was mottled with linear scars here and there even on the other. Naruto cracked his N and sneered. Damn, he looks like he was run through a meat grinder, about 10 times. Itachi continued to watch the scene that he was recreating through his jutsu and explained. Naruto was curious as to what the two images were discussing, but he couldn't read their mouths, and still couldn't hear a thing save his current companion's voice. Next time, he might have to ask Itachi to put subtles into his illusion. That is the man who mentored me in unlocking the Sharingan's deepest secrets, and helped me in eradicating the clan. The Jinchuriki blinked and shot the Akatsuki member a sidelong glance, surprised with his admission that he hadn't acted alone in Sing the Uchiha. Though, it made sense. No single person, not even Itachi, could have pulled that alone, though Naruto didn't know in what sense this mentor had participated in the M. The Nukanen paused a moment, and then continued, revealing his co-conspirator's name. That is Uchiha Madara. Something odd stirred within the container's stomach when he heard the name, but Naruto was quite sure he didn't recognize it. I've never heard the name, other than the Uchiha part. You wouldn't have known, Naruto-kun. Madara was the Uchiha clan leader who helped to give birth to Konoha, through making an alliance with the Senju and their leader, the man who would go on to become known as the Shodai Hokage. Naruto blinked, and his brow creased in thought. He knew that this was something that he ought to have known, no matter what Itachi had said about it, but he'd never cared too much about learning things that weren't related to the combat arts. The various tidbits he'd picked up over time were mere coincidence, and nothing he'd gained on purpose. He needed a moment to process how damned strange this whole situation was. There he was, loitering about in a wooded stream inside a genjutsu, listening to Uchiha Itachi lecture him on Konoha's creation. He would have been a much cooler teacher than that boring milksop Iruka, at least. Then he must have gotten exiled or something, since he's standing over there. The stoic Akatsuki member continued to gaze at his own past image and Madara's. Quote. Not quite. Over time, Madara and Shodai-sama began to quarrel over village policies, which escalated into personal combat between the two. The Hokage emerged victorious, but Madara survived, consumed with hatred towards Konoha and waiting to take his revenge. For this end, he created Akatsuki, and hides within its shadow even now. Naruto put the knowledge he'd been given together with what he'd seen earlier, and came to the natural conclusion. He did consider that Itachi could have contrived this entire tale, but he couldn't see a good enough reason that the other shinobi might do so. He'd had a hostage, and had to have known the Jinchuriki wouldn't have resisted in order to protect her. He thought it odd that Itachi was revealing so much, about Akatsuki in particular. The idea that the Nukanen was making all this up as a smokescreen came to Naruto's mind again, but also again, he couldn't discern a single reason Itachi might do so. And his revenge was the Uchiha M. Itachi gave a curt nod in acknowledgement, as their surroundings began to change. The ground rippled, changing back into what looked like an urban setting once more, as the pair now stood on concrete, and the trees vanished into thin air. The scene that materialized in the tranquil glades place, however, could have been mistaken as hell. The entire world seemed to be ablaze. Charred and mutilated corpses littered Konoha's roads and avenues, smoke churned into the blood-red skies and whole buildings were incinerated into ashes. Naruto and Itachi stood atop the highest building in the village, looking down upon the death and destruction. The Jinchuriki pressed his hand against his stomach, touching the spot where his seal was. There was another attempt prior to that, one that culminated on a night in October, over a decade ago. Naruto stared out into the horizon, his ideal vantage point allowing him to see over the high encampment wall and Konoha's great main gate. Flames roared into the skies, ringing the demon, looking so much more malicious and terrible than it ever had within its cage. The blonde shook his spiked head, unwilling to believe Itachi's implication, that Madara or whoever had somehow orchestrated the beast's rampage. That's not possible. The missing nin continued on as though he hadn't heard Naruto's denial. This entire representation was embellished, the blonde knew. The fourth had stopped the demon's mouse assault well outside the village's walls. Konoha did not burn that night. Uchiha Madara was the mastermind behind the Kyuubi's rampage on Konoha. However, at this point, the Jinchuriki wasn't even listening. More smoke plumed high into the air outside the main gate, and when it cleared, a massive toad stood between Konoha and its demonic assailant, with a blonde man riding atop its head. That one person met the monster head-on, and didn't give an inch as the two enormous creatures engaged. Naruto's hatred towards Namikaze Minato diminished a little, as he watched the man risk his all to protect his home, even though it was in an imagined scene. That is my father. The blonde Jinchuriki winced, sensing the genius's attention on him again, and was even more convinced that Itachi was somehow reading his thoughts. His new knowledge about his heritage wasn't something he wanted to reveal to his captor, like that, but he couldn't help thinking about it. He crossed his arms in order to divert the matter. That's a damned lie. No human being could control that demon in its natural state. Itachi's impeccable control didn't waver a bit in response to being called a liar. However, Naruto could somehow tell that he'd managed to draw the Uchiha's ire a bit, due to the harsh, invisible pressure that clamped down on his chest as he met the other teenager's impassive stare, constricting his heart. He was reminded who he was dealing with, in a most stern manner. Even on a neutral battleground, Uchiha Itachi could decimate him in moments. Naruto had no interest in antagonizing the Sharingan master within his own mindscape. There was a slight, near imperceptible edge to Itachi's monotone when he responded. I speak the truth, Naruto-kun. Madara's hatred and resentment enabled him to call the Nine Tails into this realm, and unleash it upon the village. He was able to manipulate the Biju using the Sharingan's last, most secret power to tame the beast. Naruto understood certain things about the beast sealed within his stomach, some that he'd learned through the demon's own maw, and some he'd discovered elsewhere. Human hatred and torment did bring the Nine Tails into the living realm, unlike other Biju that were more native creatures. However, the idea that the Sharingan Dujutsu had the power to tame and control the demon was ludicrous to the extreme. Then again, the Shodai had a similar power, so it's not impossible. The demon let out a silent roar and began to thrash about with its claws and tails, causing rampant devastation as the monster began to wither on the spot, its crimson chakra gravitating towards a single spot. Naruto turned his head to the side, no longer wanting to look. The blonde didn't need to watch to know the end result. However, as we both know, the Yondaime Hokage thwarted Madara's ambitions that night. And now, he seeks something more. The Jinchuriki raised a hand to his temple, now quite sick with what seemed to be the never-ending Uchiha Madara chronicle. Look, these stories are captivating and all, but let's get to the point now. You didn't drag me to this place to bore me with old news. Naruto had a hard time telling due to the high collar on Itachi's Atatsuki cloak, but the missing nin's thin lips seemed to quirk upward ever so little in response to the blonde's interruption. Their surroundings wavered and went pitch black once more, and then materialized into what looked like an Arctic wasteland. White tundra seemed to extend into the entire world, and black lightning arced in the red skies overhead. No, Naruto-kun, I didn't. I have an important proposition to make. Naruto's suspicions perked, as he wondered what in the hell his would-be abductor might want to bargain with him about. I'm not authorized to make deals with missing nin. You know the rules as well as I do. The protocol argument didn't impress Itachi, who moved into Naruto's personal space. The Nukenin didn't attack but instead stared into the blonde Jinchuriki, so close that their noses almost touched. The container almost moved to shove him back a couple steps, but managed to catch the instinctive response in time to avoid doing something stupid. Listen to me. I agreed to eradicate the Uchiha clan under Madara's orders so that I might shatter the chains binding me. Naruto could almost empathize, though he doubted that he would have resorted to such methods as Itachi had used. He, too, had lived in an oppressive environment, and imagined that the genius had viewed his clan in much the same manner as Naruto saw Konoha on the whole. And like Itachi, he had chosen to give his service to one master rather than the organization, in his case the Sandaimon in Itachi's, this Madara person. The Uchiha's penetrating gaze continued to lock the Jinchuriki in place. However, I was misguided. I have escaped nothing. I am still bound, and all that I managed to accomplish was to replace the warden. The blonde pulled back and looked around the tundra, and shook his head as he tried to respond with something. Naruto circled around as he continued to think, concentrating hard on the snow around him, noting that his steps made no tracks as he walked. That's too bad, but it's got all to do with me. Itachi seemed to be expecting this response, as he tucked his right arm within his cloak. A midnight black lightning bolt struck the ground in the distance, but caused no real damage. The Konoha Nukenon made no attempt to invade Naruto's personal bubble again, but instead pointed at the blonde as he spoke in his emotionless tone. The container stared down at the renegade Uchiha's inscribed ring, attempting to discern the character emblazoned on it, but to no avail. You're mistaken about that. You, too, are a captive, trapped within the same cage. Naruto had no clue what the older teenager was on about now, but retorted in his usual manner, with a bitter glower on his lips. TCH, I'm no one's prisoner, and no one's pawn. At that moment, a bitter cold cut right through to Naruto's bones. Thunder boomed in combination with the lightning, and the harsh tundra wind made both his hair and Itachi's move about at random. His toes started to go numb as he sank several centimeters down into the snow. The blonde wished like all hell that he'd brought his boots rather than regular shinobi sandals, and then remembered that he'd lost those in the deluge. Itachi meanwhile continued to watch, giving no indication that the sudden changes bothered him. Perhaps he wasn't even experiencing the cold as Naruto was. The blonde assumed his companion could control perception as well, and that Itachi had placed him in this position to remind him that he had no power within this realm, and that he was indeed a pawn here. The cold, harsh wind and exploding noise overhead dissipated as soon as it had come, and the Uchiha's monotone carried in the still air once more. I told Sandaime-sama the truth. Akatsuki will never stop coming. You will continue to be hounded as long as the organization exists. This wasn't news to the Jinchuriki in the least, and was something that had been on his mind ever since the attack and capture attempt. He didn't want to leave the home that he'd started to even like despite all odds, but even the Third's protection had to have limits. This was even truer now that the old man had retired. Naruto's scowl became more pronounced, and he looked down into the snow, not wanting to acknowledge Itachi. The Akatsuki member continued on speaking, pushing home the mental advantage he'd gained on the stubborn demon vessel. You cannot hope to remain in Konoha as matters stand. Come and assist me in ending Madara and his creation, Akatsuki. I cannot kill them and escape the prison holding me in place alone, but as allies, we can splinter the cage and liberate ourselves. The blonde's spiked head snapped up in response to Itachi's admission that he wanted to neutralize the Akatsuki. He wasn't quite sure what to think about it, but he did know that he didn't trust the traitorous genius at all. The Uchiha was attempting to lull Naruto into leaving with him and kiss him without a struggle, so that Itachi could complete his mission easier and make good his mistakes in Konoha. The Jinchuriki looked at Itachi's extended open hand, close enough to reach out and touch, and shoved it aside. I said this earlier. You won't trick me, Itachi. I'd be handing him the demon on a platter. The Uchiha genius paused a short moment, and then inclined his slate head in a deliberate nod. Itachi chose not to patronize the blonde with a denial, as both knew that this was a potential outcome. Meanwhile, despite common sense, Naruto began to wonder about the idea, and whether the illusionist was perhaps being genuine. He didn't peg Itachi as a person who would be content as someone's servant, and it made sense that he would be no more willing to be tied down to Akatsuki than he had been to the Uchiha clan. That could be the ultimate result, Naruto-kun. However, Akatsuki's extraction ritual necessitates that the remaining 8 biju be captured and unsealed in advance. The Nine Tails holds the last position in the required order. That also made more sense than Naruto liked. He did know that Itachi had attacked Anbu HQ, and had captured the imprisoned Sabaku no Gaara. There had to be some reason behind that, since the Ichibi was weakest among the biju and thus worth much less as a weapon as Naruto's demon, and its container wasn't that strong either. Naruto remembered that Gaara was losing to Sasuke, a genin, perhaps as scared as a regular chunin at his best, as the invasion commenced. And that same logic applied to Naruto here, and he said as much. There's still one little problem. I haven't got the power to do all against Shinobi like this. Your partner handled me like a total punk. The illusionist quirked a brow in response, seeming to recognize that Naruto was grasping at straws in an attempt to invalidate his logic. I believe I said that there is still time until Akatsuki can extract the demon. You possess limitless potential as a Jinchuriki and will have the needed strength when the moment to move against the organization comes. Naruto didn't respond, as there was no answer that he could make. He liked the acknowledgement, not even despite the source this time, as it had been with Orochimaru. Though the two were enemies, he respected Itachi, and even looked up to the older genius to some treasonous extent. Meanwhile, the Akatsuki member waited in stoic silence, until it became obvious that Naruto wasn't going to make a decision on the matter. Enough. You do not have to decide right at this moment. A blinding pain erupted inside Naruto's head, causing his vision to turn white, and when he came to, he was sprawled on the ground inside the penthouse apartment in Tanzaku. The blonde was soaked to the bone in a chilled sweat, and his head pounded, both due to hitting it when he passed out at the start, and the mental strain that came with being inside a genjutsu so long. Naruto groused out a complaint as he pushed to his knees and rose. TCH, bastard, could have given me a little advance warning. The person in question replied in his monotone behind him, smooth as wet silk in his ear. You perhaps should have sat down in the chair as I instructed, then. Naruto reached up and ran a tired hand through his matted, sweat-drenched spikes, and looked over to where he knew that Itachi was sitting. The Uchiha seemed quite content in his high-backed chair, with one leg crossed over the other and an almost amused grin on his lips. There was no malice in the blonde's voice when he addressed the other teen. Itachi. The illusionist raised an arm and pointed towards where Yugao lay on the couch in the main room. Like Naruto, Itachi looked rather worn out, and the blonde realized that maintaining that jutsu, whatever it was, placed considerable strain on the Nukenin. For a ruthless moment, Naruto entertained turning on and assaulting Itachi while he was in a less than ideal state, but didn't and instead paused to listen to the Sharingan master. Take Azuki-san and escape through the window. You have the next 3 nights to consider the proposal. I will be waiting at the old castle at dawn on the subsequent morning to hear a decision. The container now recognized that near smug grin on the Akatsuki member as being identical to what he thought he'd seen during the attack upon his escape, and he now knew that he hadn't imagined it then. Itachi had allowed him to escape Akatsuki's clutches on purpose. Naruto was now more puzzled than ever, and wanting to know what in the hell the Uchiha's game was as he moved over to Yugao, keeping his narrowed gaze on Itachi the entire time. You're letting me go. Itachi uncrossed his legs and stood, deactivating his Sharingan. Naruto glanced at the penthouse's single entrance as he spoke. Don't be concerned with Kisame. I'll handle him. The semi-conscious, near-delirious Yugao struggled against Naruto's attempts to remove her, clinging to the thick blanket in a desperate manner. Her skin was still ice-cold, which the blonde thought to be somewhat odd, as she ought to have warmed at least a little during the time he had spent with Itachi. At last Naruto managed to extricate the kunoichi, and then made a shadow clone to help place Yugao over his back, wrapping her arms around his and her legs around his waist. Almost at once, she snuggled harder against him, burrowing into his warmth on sheer natural instinct. He tried to ignore the shudder that ran through him when she buried her head into his and made towards the rear window. Naruto threw it open and saw that Kisame's mist lingered in the road below still, as thick as it had been when he'd entered the apartment. It's like time stood still while I was in the genjutsu. He supposed Itachi hadn't been exaggerating about his being able to control time inside his illusion realm. The blonde Jinchuriki tossed one last look back towards the Akatsuki member, or Akatsuki traitor, he supposed now. The Uchiha shooed him outside, and Naruto nodded and leapt out into the darkness with Yugao wrapped around him like a boa constrictor, drawing and lengthening the kusanagi as he exited, in case Itachi changed his mind, or Kisame decided to ignore his partner's request. As soon as Naruto was gone, Uchiha Itachi's modest, quiet grin widened into a total, victorious smirk. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.